Have you ever trusted your own child so completely that you never imagined they could steal the one place filled with your happiest memories? I did. If someone had warned me that my own daughter would one day sell the home her mother and I built with 48 years of love, I would have called them cruel. I wish they had been right for the wrong reasons. My name is John Carter. I am 72 years old, and until 6 months ago, I believed I had lived a blessed life. My wife, Margaret, and I raised our only daughter, Emily, inside a small white house with blue shutters. Every wall carried a memory. The marks on the kitchen doorframe showed Emily's height as she grew. The old oak tree in the backyard still held the swing I built with my own hands. After Margaret passed away from cancer, that house became the only place where I still felt close to her. Every morning I sat on the front porch with a cup of coffee, talking to her photograph as if she were still listening. Emily started visiting every weekend. She cooked my favorite meals, cleaned the house, hugged me, and kept saying, "Dad, I only want what is best for you." Those words healed a part of my broken heart. I never questioned her kindness. Then small things began changing. She insisted on organizing my bills. She asked strange questions about the deed to the house. She even suggested that keeping such a large home was becoming too much for someone my age. I laughed and told her I would leave that house only when God called me home. She smiled, but there was something cold behind her eyes that disappeared before I could understand it. A week later, she arrived carrying a folder full of papers. "Just routine documents, Dad," she said. "They will make it easier for me to help if you ever get sick." I trusted my daughter more than I trusted myself. Without reading every page, I picked up my pen. As the ink touched the paper, I noticed something strange. Emily was not watching me. She was watching the house through the living room window, smiling as though it already belonged to her. At that moment, I felt a chill run through my body, but I had no idea that Margaret had seen this betrayal coming years before she died, and she had left behind something that would change everything. The moment I finished signing those papers, Emily quickly gathered every page before I could read them again. "Dad, I will keep these safe," she said with a smile that looked warm enough to fool anyone. I nodded, but something inside me refused to settle. That night I walked through every room of the house, touching the walls Margaret had painted with her own hands. I stopped in our bedroom and stared at her photograph. "I hope I did the right thing," I whispered. For the first time since her funeral, I felt as though she wanted to warn me about something. The next morning, Emily called unusually early. She sounded excited. "Dad, I found a wonderful retirement community. You would love it there," I laughed softly. "Emily, I am not going anywhere. Your mother and I built this house together." I promised her I would stay here as long as I could. There was a long silence. Before she replied, "Sometimes promises have to change." Those words stayed in my mind all day. A few days later, my neighbor, Mr. Wilson, stopped while walking his dog. He looked nervous. "John, I saw 2 people taking pictures of your house yesterday. They looked like real estate agents." I smiled and shook my head. "You must be mistaken. My house is not for sale." He hesitated before leaving. "I hope you are right." His words refused to leave my thoughts. That evening, I asked Emily if anyone had been asking about the house. She answered too quickly. "Of course not, Dad. Why would anyone?" Then she immediately changed the subject. It was the first time in her life she had avoided looking me in the eyes. Days passed, and strangers began driving slowly past my home, stopping just long enough to study the front yard before leaving. One afternoon, I even found a business card on my porch from a local real estate company. When I called the number, the receptionist sounded confused. "Sir, according to our records, your property already has an active sales file." My heart almost stopped. "There has to be some mistake," I whispered. The woman apologized and ended the call. I stood frozen in the kitchen, unable to breathe. Before I could call Emily, my eyes landed on Margaret's old wooden jewelry box sitting quietly on the bookshelf. Hidden beneath it was a small envelope I had somehow never noticed before. And across the front, in Margaret's handwriting, were 7 words that made my hands begin to shake. "Open this only if Emily betrays you." I could not bring myself to open the envelope right away. My hands were trembling too badly. Margaret had always been careful with her words. She would never have written something so serious unless she believed it might really happen. I slowly sat in her favorite chair, took a deep breath, and broke the seal. Inside was a handwritten letter and a small silver key taped to the back. The first sentence made my heart sink. "John, if you are reading this, then the person we loved most has chosen money over family." Tears filled my eyes before I could continue. Margaret wrote that years before her illness became serious, she had noticed Emily asking strange questions about our savings, the deed to the house, and our insurance policies. At first she blamed it on curiosity, but over time she realized Emily's husband was drowning in debt. Margaret never accused our daughter because she hoped love would change her heart. Instead, she quietly prepared for the day she feared might come. The letter instructed me not to confront Emily, not yet. People who lie reveal the truth when they believe they have already won. Margaret had written, "The silver key belonged to a safety deposit box at the bank, one that only Margaret and I knew about. She told me there were documents inside that would protect me if anyone ever tried to take our home through deception." Before I could finish reading, my phone rang. It was Emily. Her voice sounded unusually cheerful. "Dad, I have wonderful news. Tomorrow I am taking you to see that retirement community I told you about. You are going to love it." I quietly looked around the living room, at every photograph, every memory, every promise Margaret and I had built together. Then I answered, "All right, sweetheart, I will go." Emily laughed with relief, believing I had finally surrendered. What she did not know was that I had already decided to visit the bank first thing in the morning. If Margaret had hidden proof inside that safety deposit box, then my daughter's perfect plan was about to face its first obstacle. And deep inside, for the first time since Margaret died, I felt that my wife was still fighting beside me. Emily's smile never changed. But from that day forward, I started noticing things I had ignored before. Every conversation somehow returned to the house. She asked whether I still remembered where Margaret kept old documents. She wanted to know if I had updated my will. She even suggested I should stop wasting money on maintaining such a large, empty place. I pretended not to notice. Margaret's letter was now hidden safely inside my jacket, and the small silver key never left my pocket. The next morning I drove to the bank alone. My heart pounded as the manager unlocked the safety deposit box that Margaret had rented years earlier. Inside was a thick envelope, a flash drive, copies of our property records, and another handwritten note. Margaret's words made my hands tremble. If Emily has reached this point, then she believes she has already won. Do not stop her yet. Let her reveal everything, herself. Beneath the note were copies of every legal document proving the house could never be sold without my informed consent. There was also a signed statement from our family attorney explaining that Margaret had warned him years earlier about the possibility of someone manipulating me after her death. My wife had quietly prepared for the worst while still hoping it would never happen. Before leaving the bank, I plugged the flash drive into the manager's computer. It contained security, footage and scanned documents that Margaret had carefully collected over several years. I realized this was far bigger than I had imagined. She had not simply suspected Emily. She had been documenting unusual behavior long before she became ill. As I drove home, my phone rang. It was Emily. "Dad," she said happily, "good news. I already found someone interested in buying your house. They are offering an amazing price." My hands tightened around the steering wheel. She had just admitted something she believed I did not know. I forced myself to sound surprised. "Selling my house? I never agreed to that." She laughed nervously. "Do not worry. Everything is under control." When the call ended, I looked at the envelope beside me. Margaret had been right. Emily was moving much faster than either of us expected. But one question kept echoing in my mind. If my daughter was already talking to buyers, then who had given her the legal authority to sell my home? For the rest of that afternoon, I could think of nothing except Emily's careless words. She had spoken about selling my house, as if the decision had already been made. That night I searched every drawer where I kept important papers. The original property deed was gone. So were several financial records Margaret had always kept neatly organized. I wanted to believe there had to be an innocent explanation, but deep inside I already knew the truth was far darker. The next morning, I drove to the county records office. Without telling Emily, I handed the clerk my identification and asked for the latest property records. She typed for a few seconds, then looked at me with confusion. "Mr. Carter, according to our system, your property was transferred 3 weeks ago and is currently under contract for sale." My heart stopped. "Transferred to whom?" I asked quietly. She turned the monitor toward me. There, under the owner's representative, was my daughter's name. Attached to the file was a power of attorney carrying what looked like my signature. I stared at it for several long seconds. It was my handwriting, but I had never knowingly signed a power of attorney giving Emily permission to sell my home. Suddenly, I remembered the thick stack of routine paperwork she had asked me to sign after Margaret's funeral. My knees felt weak. She had hidden the real document among dozens of harmless pages. Knowing I trusted her enough not to read every line, The betrayal hurt far more than the fraud itself. Before leaving the office, I asked for certified copies of every document. As the clerk handed them to me, she quietly said, "If you believe these papers were signed without informed consent, you should speak to an attorney immediately." I thanked her and walked outside. But before I could reach my car, I noticed Emily's SUV parked across the street. She had followed me. She stepped out wearing the same warm smile she always used around me. "Dad," she said softly, "why are you looking at property records? You are only making things harder." It was the first time she did not even try to hide what she had done. I looked into my daughter's eyes and realized I barely recognized the woman standing in front of me. Still, I remembered Margaret's warning, "Do not stop her yet. Let her believe she has already won." So I forced a tired smile, folded the documents, and quietly said, "You are right, sweetheart. I am done asking questions." Emily smiled with relief, completely unaware that I had just decided to visit the one person Margaret trusted more than anyone else, our family attorney. The drive to Mr. Harrison's law office felt longer than it ever had before. Every mile forced me to accept a truth I had spent my entire life refusing to believe. My own daughter had not made a mistake. She had made a plan. When I stepped into the office, Mr. Harrison stood up immediately. He had been Margaret's attorney for more than 30 years, and the sadness in his eyes told me he already knew why I was there. Without saying a word, I placed the certified property records and the so-called power of attorney on his desk. He studied every page carefully before letting out a long sigh. "John," he said quietly, "Margaret asked me to prepare for this day years ago." My heart pounded. He opened a locked cabinet and removed a thick file with Margaret's name written across the front. Inside were letters, legal notes, copies of old emails, and a sealed envelope marked, "Open only if Emily attempts to sell the house." Mr. Harrison explained that Margaret had become concerned after overhearing Emily and her husband arguing about debt several years earlier. She never stopped loving her daughter, but she feared desperation might one day overcome her judgment. Instead of accusing Emily, Margaret secretly documented everything and asked the attorney to keep the evidence safe. Then Mr. Harrison handed me another surprise. It was a notarized statement signed by Margaret just weeks before her death. In it, she declared that if anyone ever used deception, manipulation, or hidden paperwork to obtain control of our home, she wanted every legal action possible taken to protect me. Tears blurred my vision. Even while fighting cancer, Margaret had been thinking about my future. "Can we stop the sale?" I asked. Mr. Harrison nodded slowly. "Yes, but not today." I looked at him in confusion. He leaned forward and lowered his voice. "If we act now, Emily will claim it was all a misunderstanding. But if we allow the closing process to continue, she will expose every lie herself. The evidence will become impossible to deny." It was exactly what Margaret had written in her letter. She wanted the truth to reveal itself naturally. As I prepared to leave, Mr. Harrison handed me a small flash drive. "Margaret made one final video," he said. "She asked me not to play it until the day everyone involved is gathered in one room." I slipped the flash drive into my pocket, feeling both terrified and hopeful. Just as I reached my car, my phone buzzed with a message from Emily. "Dad, the buyers are coming to see the house tomorrow. Please make a good impression." She still believed I knew nothing. But tomorrow, her carefully built lie would take one more step toward the moment it completely collapsed. The next morning arrived far too quickly. I barely slept. Every creak of the old house reminded me of the life Margaret and I had built together, and every sunrise through the kitchen window felt like it might be my last in the home we loved. At exactly 10 o'clock, 2 luxury SUVs pulled into the driveway. A well-dressed couple stepped out with a real estate agent, smiling as they admired the front porch and the flower garden Margaret had planted years ago. Emily greeted them like the house already belonged to her. "Welcome," she said proudly. "This will soon be yours." Those words cut deeper than I expected. I stood quietly in the hallway, pretending to be nothing more than an old man who had accepted his fate. The buyers walked from room to room, complimenting the hardwood floors, the fireplace, and the backyard. One of them looked at me kindly and asked, "Sir, are you excited about your new place?" Before I could answer, Emily interrupted. "Dad cannot wait. The retirement community is beautiful, and he agreed this house is simply too much for him now." I looked at her, but said nothing. Every lie she told was becoming another piece of evidence. As the tour continued, I noticed the real estate agent handing Emily a folder. She opened it just enough for me to see the words, closing documents printed across the top. My heart sank. They were already preparing to finalize the sale. When everyone gathered in the dining room, the buyers began discussing renovation plans. They talked about removing Margaret's rose garden, tearing down the old oak tree, and completely remodeling the kitchen where we had celebrated every Christmas for nearly 5 decades. Emily smiled and agreed with every suggestion, never once asking how I felt. At that moment, I realized she was not only selling a house, she was erasing our family's history. Just as the buyers prepared to leave, the real estate agent asked one final question. "Mr. Carter, would you mind confirming in front of everyone that you fully approve this sale?" The room became completely silent. Emily looked at me with quiet confidence, certain I would repeat the story she had invented. I slowly stood up, looked around the room, and took a deep breath. Then I calmly replied, "I would love to answer that question, but first I think everyone deserves to hear something my late wife recorded before she died." Emily's smile disappeared. For the first time since Margaret's funeral, the room fell completely silent. Emily's face turned pale for just a second before she forced another smile. "Dad," she said with a nervous laugh, "this is not the right time." I looked at her calmly. "I think it is the perfect time." Before she could stop me, I pulled the flash drive from my pocket and handed it to the real estate agent. "Would you mind connecting this to the television?" The buyers exchanged confused glances, but curiosity quickly replaced their excitement. Within moments, Margaret's face appeared on the screen. She looked weak from her illness, yet her voice was steady and full of strength. "If you are watching this," she began, "then someone has tried to take our home without John's full understanding." Emily's confidence vanished instantly. Margaret continued, "John would never willingly sell this house while he is alive. If anyone tells you otherwise, ask to see every document carefully. Ask how those signatures were obtained. Ask who truly benefited from this sale." The room became so quiet that no one dared move. Then Margaret looked directly into the camera and spoke words that froze everyone. "Emily, if you are standing in this room, I prayed every day that you would prove me wrong. I hoped love would be stronger than greed. If I was right, then I am deeply sorry for the choices you made." Emily suddenly stood up. "Turn it off," she shouted. "This video means nothing." But before anyone touched the television, the family attorney walked through the front door carrying a thick legal file. "Actually," Mr. Harrison said calmly, "it means everything." He placed the file on the dining table and revealed notarized statements, certified copies of the original property deed, and Margaret's written instructions prepared years before her death. He explained that Margaret had anticipated this exact situation and had preserved evidence proving John never knowingly authorized the sale of his home. The buyers stared at Emily in disbelief. The real estate agent slowly closed the folder containing the closing papers. "Are you telling me this transaction may have been based on fraudulent documents?" he asked. Mr. Harrison answered without hesitation. "That is exactly what I am saying." Emily looked around the room, searching for someone to defend her, but every face had changed. The buyers were no longer smiling. The agent had stepped away from her. Even her own husband refused to meet her eyes. Yet the biggest surprise was still waiting inside the attorney's file, because Margaret had left behind one final document that nobody, not even Emily, knew existed. Mr. Harrison waited until every eye in the room was fixed on him before opening the final sealed envelope from Margaret's file. Even Emily stopped breathing for a moment. "This document," he said calmly, "was prepared 6 months before Margaret passed away and was to be opened only if someone attempted to sell this house through deception." He carefully removed several pages and placed them on the table. The first was a sworn affidavit signed by Margaret, explaining in detail why she feared someone might pressure John into signing documents he did not fully understand while grieving. The second was a notarized instruction giving Mr. Harrison authority to immediately challenge any suspicious property transfer. Then came the document that changed everything. It was a forensic handwriting agreement Margaret had arranged years earlier. If there was ever a dispute over John's signature, an independent handwriting expert could compare every page. John had signed that day with the original documents. Emily suddenly interrupted. "This is ridiculous. Dad signed everything himself." Mr. Harrison looked directly at her. "He signed papers, yes, but the law also asks whether he knew what he was signing." The buyers exchanged worried looks. The real estate agent quietly stepped aside and began making phone calls. Emily's husband finally spoke for the first time. "Emily, you told me your father wanted to move." She looked at him in panic but could not answer. The attorney then revealed another surprise. Hidden inside the file was a timeline Margaret had written by hand, listing every unusual conversation Emily had ever had about money, the house, and their estate over the previous 4 years. Margaret had dated each entry carefully, never accusing her daughter outright, only recording facts. The evidence showed this had not been a sudden decision born from grief. It had been a plan slowly taking shape for years. Emily's confidence disappeared completely. She looked at me with tears in her eyes and whispered, "Dad, I can explain." I met her eyes but remained silent. For too long, I had spoken while others ignored me. Now it was her turn to face silence. Just as Mr. Harrison prepared to continue, 2 uniformed police officers walked through the front door. They had been called by the title company after learning there were allegations of fraudulent documents connected to the property sale. One officer politely asked, "Who is Emily Carter?" The room froze again. Emily slowly turned around, realizing the nightmare she had tried so hard to avoid had only just begun. The officers stepped into the living room with calm expressions, but the tension in the house became almost unbearable. One of them politely introduced himself and explained that the title company had reported a possible case of property fraud. "We are not here to arrest anyone today," he said. "We are here to determine whether this real estate transaction should be suspended while the facts are reviewed." Emily immediately tried to regain control. "Officer, this is just a family misunderstanding. My father signed every document willingly." Before either officer could respond, Mr. Harrison quietly placed the certified copies of the property records, Margaret's affidavit, and the questionable power of attorney on the dining table. The officers carefully examined each page. One of them finally looked at me and asked, "Mr. Carter, when you signed these papers, did you know you were authorizing the sale of your home?" I answered honestly, "No, I believed I was signing routine paperwork so my daughter could help me manage my bills if I became ill." The officer slowly nodded and wrote down every word. Emily's face grew pale. Her husband stepped farther away from her, looking completely shocked. The buyers stood in silence, realizing they had nearly purchased a home caught in a legal disaster. Then the title company called the real estate agent. He listened for nearly a minute before ending the call. Looking directly at the buyers, he announced, "The closing has officially been suspended. No money will be transferred until this investigation is complete." The couple immediately thanked the officers and Mr. Harrison for preventing what could have become an expensive legal nightmare. As they prepared to leave, the woman gently placed her hand on my shoulder. "Sir," she said, "we are truly sorry. We had no idea this house meant so much to you." Tears filled my eyes as I thanked her. For the first time in weeks, I felt someone had actually seen the truth. Emily suddenly broke down. "Dad, please. I was going to tell you everything after the sale. We needed the money." Her voice trembled, but I remembered every lie. Every fake smile and every moment she had watched me sign papers without telling me what they really were. Before I could answer, Mr. Harrison opened one final envelope that had remained sealed until now. He looked at me and quietly said, "John." Margaret asked me to read this letter only after the sale was officially stopped. The entire room fell silent once again, because everyone knew Margaret's final words were about to reveal the last piece of the truth. Mr. Harrison unfolded Margaret's final letter with trembling hands. Even after all these years of practicing law, I could see the emotion in his eyes. He cleared his throat and began reading aloud. "My dearest John, if this letter is being read today, then our home has survived the greatest test it will ever face. I know you are hurting, not because of the house, but because the person betraying you is someone we once held in our arms as a little girl. Please do not let hatred become your final memory of her. Let justice do its work, but never allow bitterness to steal your peace." Tears rolled down my face. Before he reached the next page, Margaret then addressed Emily directly. "Emily, if you are listening, I loved you with every part of my heart. Nothing you have done can erase the years when you made us proud. But every choice has a consequence. Money can rebuild a house. It cannot rebuild trust." Nobody in the room dared speak. Emily lowered her head, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Then Mr. Harrison read the final section. Margaret revealed that she had left behind a separate trust fund created years earlier for Emily and any future grandchildren. It contained enough money to solve every financial problem Emily had been struggling with. The only condition was simple. The trust would remain untouched as long as Emily never attempted to deceive or financially exploit either parent. If that condition was broken, the entire trust would automatically be redirected to charities supporting elderly people who had been victims of financial abuse. Emily gasped, "No, That cannot be true. Mr. Harrison quietly placed the trust documents on the table. Every signature and every legal requirement had already been verified years before. Margaret's death. Emily had thrown away the very future she believed she was stealing. Instead of asking for help, she had chosen deception. Instead of gaining a fortune, she had lost everything her mother had planned to leave her. I looked at my daughter as tears streamed down her face. She whispered, "Dad." "I never knew," I answered softly. "That is because you never trusted us enough to ask." The room remained silent, but I sensed the story was still not over. The legal consequences had only begun, and the hardest conversation of my life was waiting just outside that front door. I walked outside because I could no longer breathe inside the house. The front porch, where Margaret and I had spent countless evenings watching the sunset, suddenly felt different. A few minutes later, the front door opened, and Emily slowly stepped outside. She looked nothing like the confident woman who had welcomed the buyers only an hour earlier. Her eyes were red, her shoulders were trembling, and for the first time in weeks, she looked like the little girl who used to run into my arms after falling off her bicycle. She stopped a few feet away and quietly whispered, "Dad, I am sorry." I looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Are you sorry because you hurt me, or because your plan failed?" She could not answer. The silence said more than any excuse ever could. After several seconds, she admitted everything. Her husband had lost almost all of their savings through risky investments. Credit cards were overdue, loan payments were piling up, and they were terrified of losing their own home. Instead of asking for help, they convinced themselves that selling my house was the fastest solution. "I kept telling myself I would buy it back one day," she cried. "I never wanted to leave you with nothing." My heart broke hearing those words because I knew she actually believed them. "Emily," I said softly, "if you had walked through that front door and simply asked for help, I would have given you everything I had." Tears streamed down her face as she realized how unnecessary every lie had been. Just then, Mr. Harrison stepped outside with the two police officers. They informed Emily that a formal investigation would begin immediately, and that she would need legal representation before giving any detailed statement. The officers remained respectful, but the seriousness of the situation was impossible to ignore. Before leaving, one of them quietly told me, "Mr. Carter, we see many cases where strangers take advantage of seniors. It is always the hardest when it is family." I nodded without saying a word. As Emily was preparing to leave with her husband, she turned back one last time. "Dad, do you think you will ever forgive me?" I closed my eyes, remembering Margaret's final letter. Justice had begun, but forgiveness was a different journey entirely. I looked at my daughter and quietly replied, "That answer does not belong to today." Emily lowered her head and walked toward her car, unaware that another surprise was waiting for her, one that even Mr. Harrison had not discovered until that very morning. The next morning, Mr. Harrison called before I had even finished my coffee. His voice sounded more serious than ever. "John, I need you to come to my office immediately. We found something last night that changes this case completely." My heart began racing again. I thought the worst was already behind me, but I quickly realized Margaret's careful planning had gone even deeper than any of us imagined. When I arrived, Mr. Harrison placed a thick envelope on his desk. This was delivered by the title company after they reviewed every document connected to the sale, he explained. Inside were emails, electronic signatures, and payment records that had not been disclosed before. As we read through them, one fact became painfully clear. Emily had not acted alone. Her husband had been communicating directly with the real estate agent for months, discussing the estimated value of my house, the best time to list it, and even how quickly they could move me into a retirement facility after the closing. One message made my stomach turn. It read, "Once John is out, we can renovate and flip the property within 6 months." They were not trying to save their family. They were planning an investment. Mr. Harrison looked at me with sadness. "John, this was never an emergency decision. It was organized long before Margaret passed away." I sat there in complete silence. The betrayal was no longer just about money. They had been waiting for the right moment while Margaret was fighting for her life. Then Mr. Harrison handed me another document that had just arrived from the bank. It showed that a large deposit had already been promised to Emily and her husband the moment the sale closed. They had already decided how they would spend the money. Luxury vacations, expensive furniture, and paying off personal debts filled the handwritten budget they had prepared together. Not $1 had been set aside for my future care. Tears filled my eyes, not because of the money, but because I finally understood the painful truth. They had never planned to protect me. They had planned to remove me. Just as I was trying to process everything, Mr. Harrison's assistant knocked on the office door. "Sir," she said quietly, "the district attorney's office is here." A sharply dressed prosecutor entered, shook my hand and calmly said, "Mr. Carter, after reviewing the evidence, we are preparing formal criminal charges. But before we file them, there is one decision that only you can make." The prosecutor closed the office door before speaking again. "Mr. Carter," he said, "the evidence is strong enough to support charges of fraud, financial exploitation, and filing false legal documents. But because Emily is your daughter, the law allows us to consider your wishes before moving forward." Those words settled heavily on my heart. Part of me wanted justice. Another part still remembered the little girl who used to run into my arms after school. Mr. Harrison remained silent, giving me time to think. Finally, I looked up and asked, "If I choose mercy, does that erase what happened?" The prosecutor slowly shook his head. "No, mercy and accountability are not the same thing," he explained. "That even if I asked for leniency, the fraudulent property transfer would still be voided, and the financial investigation would continue, because forged legal documents affected more than just our family." Just then, the office receptionist informed us that Emily had arrived unexpectedly. She asked if she could speak with me alone. After a brief hesitation, I agreed. Emily entered quietly, looking exhausted. Gone were the expensive clothes and confident smile. She placed a folder on the desk and pushed it toward me. Inside were cashier's checks, jewelry receipts, and documents showing she had already sold her car and withdrawn nearly every dollar from her savings. "Dad," she whispered through tears, "I am trying to return everything before the court forces me to. I know it will never undo what I did, but I cannot keep living with this guilt." I looked through the papers without saying a word. Then she handed me one final envelope. "I found this hidden inside Mom's old sewing box after I got home," she said. "It has your name on it. I never knew it existed." My hands began trembling as I recognized Margaret's handwriting. This was different from every other letter. Across the front she had written, "John. Read this only after Emily tells you the truth on her own." I stared at the envelope for several seconds. Margaret had somehow known that this moment might come. Whatever was inside that final letter would not only decide Emily's future, it would decide the future of our entire family. My hands trembled as I opened Margaret's final letter. Unlike the others, this one was only a single page long. "John," it began, "if Emily has brought you this letter herself, then she has finally chosen truth over another lie. That does not erase what she has done, but it tells me there is still hope for the little girl we raised." I could barely continue reading through my tears. Margaret asked me to remember that justice protects the innocent, but forgiveness heals the wounded. She warned me never to confuse forgiveness with forgetting. "Do not rescue her from the consequences of her choices," she wrote. "Let those consequences teach her what our words never could." I slowly lowered the letter and looked at Emily. She was crying quietly, not asking for money, not asking for the house, only waiting for my answer. For the first time since this nightmare began, I believed her tears were real. I reached across the desk and held her shaking hands. "Emily," I said softly, "I forgive you because carrying this pain will only destroy what is left of my life. But forgiveness does not mean pretending none of this happened." She nodded before I even finished speaking. "I understand, Dad. I will accept whatever happens." A few minutes later, the prosecutor returned. I handed him Margaret's letter and calmly said, "I will not stand in the way of the law. Let justice take its course. I only ask that no decision be made out of anger." He nodded respectfully. The fraudulent sale was officially canceled. My home's title was restored entirely in my name, and the investigation moved forward. Emily and her husband would have to answer for every document they had signed and every lie they had told. As we walked out of the office together, Emily quietly whispered, "Dad, thank you for not giving up on me completely." I looked at the house waiting for me across town and smiled sadly. "I never gave up on you, Emily. You were the one who gave up on us." She lowered her head, unable to answer. I believed the story had finally reached its end. But when I returned home that evening, a black luxury car was parked in my driveway. A woman I had never seen before stepped out holding an old photograph of Margaret, and the first words she spoke changed everything once again. The woman stood beside the black car for several seconds, holding an old photograph of Margaret against her chest. She looked to be in her late 60s, and there was something strangely familiar about her face. Before I could ask who she was, she smiled gently and said, "You must be John Carter. Margaret asked me to come only after everything was over." My heart skipped a beat. I invited her inside, and we sat in the same living room, where my entire world had fallen apart. Only days earlier, she placed the photograph on the coffee table. It showed Margaret standing beside the woman nearly 30 years ago. "My name is Sarah Bennett," she explained. "Margaret and I were college roommates. We stayed close all our lives, but she asked me to keep our friendship private. After she became ill, Sarah opened her handbag and carefully removed a small wooden box tied with a faded blue ribbon. Margaret gave me this 3 months before she passed away. She said I was to deliver it only if your house was saved." My hands trembled as I untied the ribbon. Inside was a simple gold wedding band that Margaret thought had been lost 20 years earlier while gardening. Beneath it was one final note written in her elegant handwriting. "John, if this box has reached you, then our home is still standing. That means love defeated greed and truth defeated lies. Do not spend the rest of your life mourning what happened. Fill this house with laughter again. Open your door to family, friends, neighbors, and anyone who needs kindness. Our home was never just wood and bricks. It was always the love inside it." Tears rolled down my face as I slipped the ring into my palm. Sarah quietly smiled. "She talked about you until her very last day. She never doubted you would find the strength to protect yourself." After Sarah left, I walked through every room of the house once more. Nothing looked different, yet everything had changed. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt peaceful. I stepped onto the front porch where Margaret and I had shared countless sunsets, slipped her wedding band beside my own, and looked toward the old oak tree swaying gently in the evening breeze. For the first time since losing my wife, I smiled without forcing it. I realized Margaret's greatest gift had never been the legal documents, the letters, or the evidence she left behind. Her greatest gift was reminding me that even after the deepest betrayal, a heart built on love can still become a home again. Years have passed since that day, yet every morning I still sit on the same front porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sunrise over the house Margaret and I built together. The walls are older now, the oak tree is taller, and the rose garden she planted blooms every spring, as faithfully as it always did. Emily accepted responsibility for her actions. The court declared the property transfer fraudulent, canceled every document connected to the sale, and ordered restitution for the legal costs caused by the deception. She and her husband lost far more than money. They lost the trust of the people who loved them most. Rebuilding that trust took years, not weeks. During that time, Emily visited often, never asking for forgiveness again. Instead, she quietly repaired broken fences, mowed the lawn, cooked dinner, and sat beside me without expecting anything in return. She finally understood that love is proven through actions, not promises. One afternoon, as we stood together beneath the old oak tree, she looked at me with tears in her eyes and said, "Dad, Mom was right. I spent so much time chasing what I wanted that I almost lost what mattered most." I smiled sadly and replied, "Your mother left us many gifts, Emily. The greatest one was not this house. It was the chance to choose who we become after we fail." She hugged me the way she had as a little girl, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt that my family had begun to heal. I still miss Margaret every single day, but I no longer speak to her photograph with sorrow. I speak with gratitude. She protected me when she knew she would no longer be here. She saved our home, but more importantly, she saved what remained of our family. If this story teaches anything, it is this: the deepest betrayals often come from the people we love most. But honesty, patience, and justice will always outlast greed. Money can buy a house, but it can never replace a home built with love. And every evening, as the sun disappears behind the old oak tree, I smile because I know Margaret kept her final promise. Even after saying goodbye, she never stopped protecting me.